house that whispers. Halloween has always been my favorite time of year, the one night where everything eerie and unnatural feels just a little closer. This year, my friends had convinced me to do something none of us had dared before. Visit the old Grayson house. It sat at the edge of town, hidden by a wall of gnarled oak trees, its dark silhouette looming like a secret best left alone. For as long as I could remember, it had been the subject of every ghost story whispered in our small town. People said it was cursed, haunted by the spirits of its former owners. A family that vanished without a trace one Halloween night decades ago. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But when my friends started calling me a coward for hesitating, I caved. "You've got to go in alone," Jake had said, his grin all bravado. "If you make it through the night, we'll call you the bravest person alive. Deal?" I rolled my eyes, but deep down, my pride wouldn't let me back down. Deal. The house looked even worse up close. The wooden boards were warped and weathered, the paint long since peeled away. The windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch me as I approached. A rusted wind chime hung on the porch, barely swaying in the still night air. The front door was slightly ajar. That should have been my first warning. I stepped inside, the old floor groaning under my weight. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like blood. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust-covered furniture and cobwebbed corners. The house felt wrong. I decided to start with the living room. A grand fireplace dominated one wall, its stone mantel cracked and crumbling. Above it hung a family portrait. My breath caught in my throat. The painting showed a family of 4, a mother, father, and 2 young children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Their smiles were stiff, their eyes too wide. But it wasn't their expressions that sent a chill down my spine. It was the fact that the parents were staring straight ahead, but the children's eyes were looking at me. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. "Just a trick of the light," I muttered. The air shifted, a cold breeze brushing past me. I spun around, but the door was still closed. The house had no power, no running air, so where had the breeze come from? I checked my watch. 10 minutes in, 50 to go. I moved to the kitchen next, the flashlight barely illuminating the sprawling space. The counters were littered with rusted knives and broken dishes, as if the house had been abandoned in a hurry. The air here smelled worse, pungent, almost rotten. As I stepped farther in, my shoe hit something soft. I glanced down and saw a small stuffed bear, its fur matted and one button eye missing. I bent to pick it up when I heard it. A giggle. I froze. It was faint, distant, like it came from upstairs. I told myself it was my imagination. I'd read enough ghost stories to know how easily the mind played tricks in places like this. But as I straightened up, I heard the giggle again, closer this time. And then, faint but unmistakable, footsteps above me. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I didn't want to go upstairs. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to bolt out the door and never look back. But I couldn't face my friends if I gave up now. The staircase groaned with every step as I ascended, my flashlight flickering. The second floor was colder, the air sharper. A long hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with closed doors. As I reached the top step, a door at the end of the hall creaked open. "Is someone there?" I asked, the words barely a whisper. Silence. I moved toward the open door, my footsteps muffled by the dust-covered rug. The room inside was a child's bedroom. A small bed with a faded quilt sat against one wall, and a dollhouse stood in the corner, its tiny furniture overturned. But what drew my attention was the writing on the wall. Scrawled in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "Leave US." I backed out of the room, my heart pounding. The door slammed shut behind me, and I stumbled, dropping my flashlight. The hallway was dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow under another door farther down. I didn't want to go to that door. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, to get out of that house, but my legs carried me forward. The light grew brighter as I approached, and with it came a sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air felt electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. I turned the knob. The room inside was empty, save for a single rocking chair. It sat in the center of the room, rocking slowly back and forth, though there was no one there to move it. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Small, child-sized footprints tracked in dirt and leading from the chair to where I stood. They stopped just inches from my feet. The door slammed shut behind me. The rocking chair stilled. And then I felt it. A hand, small and ice-cold, slipped into mine. I screamed, yanking my hand back, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, the footprints fading as though they'd never existed. The whispers started then, faint and overlapping, voices too many to count. They grew louder, surrounding me, until I could make out the words, "Stay with us. Stay forever." I ran. The house seemed alive now, the walls groaning and the floorboards shifting under my feet. The whispers followed me, growing into a deafening roar. I reached the front door and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the air grew colder. I turned, and there they were, the family from the portrait. The parents stood side by side, their hollow eyes staring at me. The children were closer, their hands outstretched, their smiles impossibly wide. "Stay," they said in unison, their voices blending with the whispers. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was clawing at the door, and the next, I was on the street, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent once more. I never told my friends what happened that night. They laughed when I said I'd made it through, calling me fearless. But I'm not fearless. Even now, weeks later, I can still hear the whispers when I'm alone. I see small footprints in the dust of my apartment. And at night, when I close my eyes, I feel the cold, small hand slip into mine. The house on Willow Street. Halloween has always been my favorite holiday. There's something magical about the eerie glow of jack-o'-lanterns and the way the shadows stretch long into the night. This year, though, I wanted something more than candy or costumes. I wanted a real scare, a memory to last a lifetime. That's how I found myself standing in front of the house on Willow Street. Everyone in town knew about it. The stories varied. An old man who practiced dark rituals, a family who mysteriously vanished, or whispers of people going in and never coming out. It was a relic of the past. A towering Victorian structure, its paint long chipped away, leaving the wood exposed to the elements. The windows were dark, the front yard overgrown, and the porch sagged as though the house itself was weary. Nobody had lived there for decades, and for good reason. I'd heard the dare from my friends all week. Go inside, spend an hour, and prove the stories are fake. They all laughed about it, of course, but none of them were brave or foolish enough to try. I wasn't about to let a crumbling house get the better of me. The front door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the silent interior. The air inside was heavy, damp with a musty smell that reminded me of rotting wood and old paper. My flashlight beam wavered as I stepped over the threshold, its dim circle of light barely cutting through the darkness. The floor creaked underfoot as I entered the foyer. Dust coated every surface, from the ornate wooden staircase to the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at 3:13. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Shaking off the thought, I stepped into what I assumed was the living room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, though age had turned them yellow. A cold breeze whispered through the room, stirring the edges of the fabric like the faintest breath. Okay, I muttered to myself, just an old house. Nothing to worry about. I decided to explore upstairs. The staircase groaned beneath my weight, each step sounding louder than the last. The second floor was even darker, the flashlight's beam bouncing off walls lined with peeling floral wallpaper. A series of doors stretched down the hallway, each one slightly ajar. I chose the first door on the left. Inside was a bedroom. The bed frame was rusted, the mattress sagging and covered in mildew. A broken dresser leaned against the wall, its drawers half open and spilling their contents onto the floor. But what caught my attention was the smell. Something foul and metallic, like rust mixed with decay. I tried to ignore it and turned to leave, but that's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the far corner of the room, near a closet with its door hanging askew. I shone the flashlight toward it, but the beam flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as though something or someone was clawing at the inside of the closet. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding. My fingers shook as I reached for the closet door, pushing it open. Nothing. The closet was empty except for a few moth-eaten clothes hanging limply on a rod. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling foolish. "Just my imagination," I muttered, stepping back into the hallway. But as I turned, I froze. The other doors, all of them, were now wide open. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the gaping doorways. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall. Tall, motionless, watching. Then the light steadied, and the figure was gone. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, convincing myself it was just a shadow, but the air felt thicker now, harder to breathe. I needed to leave. Turning toward the stairs, I heard something behind me. A soft, low whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, guttural, wrong. I broke into a run, barreling down the stairs. The whispers followed, growing into a cacophony of voices. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all speaking over each other in a sinister, unintelligible chant. As I reached the bottom step, the grandfather clock chimed. His frozen hands now read 3:14. I sprinted toward the front door, only to find it shut tight. No matter how hard I pulled or pushed, it wouldn't budge. The voices surrounded me, their sound pressing against my skull like a vice. And then, everything went silent. The sudden absence of noise was deafening. I stood there, panting, my hand still gripping the door handle, afraid to turn around. But I felt it. Presence. Cold breath on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned my head. The figure stood just inches away. Its face was a pale, featureless void, as if someone had stretched flesh over a mannequin. Its head tilted slightly, as if curious, and its long, spindly fingers reached out toward me. I screamed, stumbling backward, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching, or at least I thought it was. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than ever, and the figure began to dissolve, its body unraveling into a swarm of shadows that surged toward me. I ducked, covering my head as the shadows swirled around me, their voices a storm of rage and despair. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the living room. The furniture was no longer covered in sheets, and the house looked new. The walls were freshly painted, the floors polished, and sunlight streamed through the windows. But something was wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. I stepped toward the front door, but my reflection in the mirror caught my attention. It wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was pale and featureless, with hollow eyes that seemed to stretch into infinity. I reached up to touch my face, and the reflection moved with me, its hollow mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. I don't remember how I got out of the house. One moment, I was staring into that horrifying reflection, and the next, I was standing on the sidewalk, gasping for air. The house on Willow Street loomed behind me, silent and unchanging. I ran home and locked every door and window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Even now, as I write this, I can see the shadows moving in the corners of my room. The whispers are faint but growing louder. I made it out of the house, but I don't think I ever really left. The Hollow House. Halloween had always been my favorite time of year. There was something about the crisp air, the scent of pumpkins, and the faint thrill of mischief that made me feel alive. This year, though, was different. My friends and I had been daring each other to visit the infamous Hollow House on the edge of town for years, but none of us ever followed through. The stories surrounding it were enough to keep even the bravest of us away. The Hollow House was an abandoned Victorian mansion, perched on a hill like a crooked crown. Its windows were shattered, its paint peeling, and its iron gate hung ajar like a gaping mouth. The legend said it was cursed, that anyone who entered would never make it through the night. This Halloween, I decided to prove the legends wrong. I arrived at the house just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The twilight cast long shadows across the overgrown yard, and the house loomed against the purple sky like a dark silhouette. My friends had backed out last minute, their excuses ranging from sick relatives to sudden, inexplicable chores. It didn't matter. I wanted to do this alone. As I pushed open the creaking gate and stepped onto the cracked stone path, a strange unease settled over me. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the house itself was watching. The front door, surprisingly, wasn't locked. It groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a grand but decayed interior. A wide staircase curved upward into darkness, and the faint smell of mildew and rotting wood filled my nostrils. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, but I stepped inside, determined to prove that this was just another abandoned house. Nothing more. The first hour was uneventful. I wandered through the rooms, shining my flashlight over peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. But then, as I entered what appeared to be a sitting room, I heard it. A soft whisper. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. A voice, low and raspy, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped. I told myself it was just the wind whistling through the broken windows. Still, my hands shook as I continued exploring, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty halls. By the time I reached the second floor, the temperature had dropped noticeably. My breath came out in small puffs of mist, and my flashlight flickered as though the batteries were dying. I stepped into what looked like a child's bedroom. The walls were painted a faded pink, and a small, dusty rocking horse stood in the corner. As I scanned the room, the flashlight beam caught something on the wall. A series of scratches, deep gouges in the wood. They weren't random. They formed words. "Get out." A chill ran down my spine. "Okay," I muttered to myself, backing out of the room. Time to leave. But as I turned toward the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I yanked at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, the rocking horse was moving, back and forth, slowly, steadily. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers started again, louder this time, and coming from all around me. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was clear now, a low, guttural rasp that seemed to echo inside my head. I screamed and threw myself against the door, and this time it flew open. I stumbled into the hallway and bolted toward the stairs, but the house seemed to shift around me. The hallway stretched impossibly long, and the staircase that had been just a few feet away now seemed miles off. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more insistent. "Stay. You can't leave. It's too late." I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally reached the stairs, I felt a surge of relief. I was so close to the door, so close to freedom. But as I descended, the staircase began to groan and creak under my weight. The wood felt soft, almost spongy, and I realized too late that it wasn't just the house deteriorating. It was changing. The stairs gave way beneath me, and I fell. I landed hard on something cold and wet. The flashlight had flown from my hand, and when I scrambled to find it, I realized I wasn't in the house anymore. I was in a basement, though I hadn't seen any sign of one during my exploration. The walls were made of stone, damp and slick, and the air was suffocatingly heavy. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its dim light barely illuminating the room. In the center was a wooden table, and on it lay a collection of objects: a cracked mirror, a rusted knife, and what looked like a child's doll with its eyes gouged out. My flashlight was on the floor nearby, and as I reached for it, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the bulb's reach. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, or at least it had been. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow pits that seemed to drink in the light. She wore a tattered dress, and her hair hung in stringy, matted clumps. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm sorry. I'll leave." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a grotesque smile. "It's too late." The bulb flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, she was gone. But I wasn't alone. The whispers started again, louder and more frantic, and I realized they weren't coming from the air around me. They were coming from the walls. The stone seemed to pulse and writhe, and I could see shapes moving just beneath the surface. Hands, faces pressing against the stone as though trying to break free. I bolted for the stairs, my flashlight swinging wildly. The steps were uneven, crumbling beneath my feet, but I climbed desperately, ignoring the whispers and the shadows that seemed to close in around me. When I reached the top, the door was gone. In its place was another message, carved deep into the wood. "You belong to us." The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the walls began to close in, the faces screaming silently as they pressed closer. I turned, searching for another way out, but the woman was there, blocking my path. She reached out, her hand impossibly long and skeletal, and as her fingers touched my skin, everything went black. I woke up in the front yard of the hollow house, the morning sun casting its warm light over the decrepit structure. My friends were standing over me, their faces pale with worry. "You were gone all night," Jack said, helping me to my feet. I turned to look at the house, and for a moment, it seemed alive, its windows glinting like malevolent eyes. I didn't say a word. I just walked away, vowing never to return. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. The house on Pine Hollow. Halloween always brought with it an air of mischief and mystery, but for the most part, it was harmless fun. Costumes, candy, and spooky tales told around dimly lit rooms. This year, however, I found myself wrapped in something far darker. Started with a dare. My friends, always in search of the next thrill, had goaded me into spending Halloween night in the old Holloway house on Pine Hollow Road. The place had been abandoned for decades, a sprawling Victorian with broken windows, sagging porches, and an eerie reputation. The stories varied, but they all pointed to one thing. No one who entered the house ever left the same. Just one night, Jack had said, grinning as he handed me a flashlight, "Prove you're not chicken." I wasn't one to back down, even though every fiber of my being told me this was a terrible idea. Armed with a sleeping bag, a thermos of coffee, and a flickering flashlight, I stepped through the creaking front door just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic I couldn't quite place. My footsteps echoed on the warped wooden floor as I explored the front parlor. A grand staircase dominated the space, its banister covered in a fine layer of dust. The wallpaper, once ornate, hung in tatters, and cobwebs adorned every corner. I set up camp in the parlor, reasoning that staying near the door was the smartest option. If anything strange happened, I could bolt. The first hour passed uneventfully. I busied myself with my phone, scrolling mindlessly and pretending the shadows in the corners weren't shifting when I wasn't looking. Around 9 p.m., the first sound came. A faint creak, like a footstep, echoed from upstairs. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I aimed it at the ceiling. The beam illuminated nothing but peeling paint and cobweb-covered beams. "Probably the wind," I muttered, though the windows were sealed shut, and there wasn't so much as a breeze outside. As the hours ticked by, the house seemed to come alive. Soft whispers floated through the air, so faint I couldn't make out the words. The temperature dropped, and an oppressive chill settled over the room. Around midnight, I heard it again. A creak, but this time it was closer, coming from the staircase. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. No response. The flashlight beam wavered as I pointed it toward the staircase. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the top of the stairs. I blinked, and it was gone. Panic began to set in, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Jack and the others would never let me live it down. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that the stories about the house were exaggerations. But then the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from all around me, a chorus of voices murmuring incoherently. I couldn't tell if they were male or female, young or old, but they were filled with something wrong. I clutched my flashlight and scanned the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that disappeared the moment I focused on them. And then I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway, a door I was certain hadn't been there when I arrived, was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the crack. Curiosity and dread warred within me, but ultimately, curiosity won. I crept toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, but still just beyond comprehension. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small room lit by a single, flickering candle. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table sat a leather-bound book, its cover adorned with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and twist when I looked at them. Against my better judgment, I reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with illegible scrawls, drawings of twisted, inhuman figures, and what looked like ritual instructions. As I flipped through, the candlelight flickered violently, and the whispers turned to anguished wails. I slammed the book shut and backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl from behind me. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam shaking as I aimed it toward the sound. Something was in the corner, a shape, hunched and monstrous, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It moved, crawling toward me with unnatural speed, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I screamed and bolted from the room, the book forgotten. The house seemed to shift around me, the hallways stretching and twisting as I ran. The stairs were farther than they should have been, and no matter how fast I moved, the growling grew closer. I stumbled into the parlor and slammed the door shut behind me, pressing my weight against it. My heart thundered in my chest as the growling turned to pounding, the thing on the other side clawing at the wood. Desperate, I grabbed my phone and tried to call Jack, but the screen was filled with static. The pounding stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard a voice. "You shouldn't have opened the book." I whipped around, the flashlight beam landing on a figure. It was human, or at least it had been. Its face was gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its skull. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. What do you want?" I stammered, backing away. It didn't answer. Instead, it pointed toward the window. I turned, and my blood ran cold. Outside, in the darkness, dozens of figures stood, their glowing eyes fixed on the house. The figure in the corner began to laugh, a hollow, echoing sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Run," it said. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the front door, throwing it open and sprinting down the driveway. The woods on either side seemed alive, shadows darting between the trees, the whispers following me as I ran. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I jumped in, started the engine, and peeled out of there, the house disappearing in my rearview mirror. I didn't tell Jack or anyone else what happened that night. I wanted to forget, to pretend it had all been a nightmare. But the next morning, I found the book sitting on my kitchen table, its symbols writhing as if mocking me. And from the corner of my eye, I could see the figures watching.